Jake hesitated at the rusty gate of Blackmont Prison, peering into the gloom that shrouded the abandoned building's courtyard. Though the moon shone bright overhead, not a glimmer of light penetrated the cell blocks and guard towers looming before him. Something about the crumbling Gothic facade stirred feelings of unease in his heart, as if long-forgotten echoes of anguish and suffering still lingered in the prison's dilapidated walls. Shaking off the ominous premonition, Jake steeled his nerves and slipped inside. His flashlight beam swept over piles of debris, scraps of uniforms and manacles left to rust where they fell generations ago. Shards of memories not his own whispered from each fragmented recollection, tales of suffering and madness which had transpired within these walls. Yet underneath it all beat a darker secret, a mystery which had drawn Jake inside on this chill autumn night. Venturing deeper, the flashlight picked out scratched messages scrawled on cell doors by forgotten inmates. Pleas for mercy, frantic tracks of madness, ominous warnings. Jake shuddered to think of the souls who had breathed their last in this dismal place. As he explored, his footfalls stirred phantom echoes down the corridors. Around each corner, he expected to glimpse pale figures shuffling after him in chains. Descending a crumbling spiral staircase, Jake emerged in the sublevels, the utility tunnels and maintenance areas running like veins beneath the prison complex. Here the darkness lay thicker, as if some quality in the dusty air sought to smother light itself. Jake's flashlight faltered more often, as if its beam grew heavy and weak. Strange. He was sure he had charged the batteries that morning. A flutter of movement in his peripheral vision caused Jake to wheel, heart pounding, but nothing resolved from the gloom. He chided himself for letting his imagination run wild, blaming the asylum's oppressive atmosphere for playing tricks on his frazzled nerves. Pressing on, Jake noticed scrapings and gouge marks scoring the concrete floors and walls like desperate claw marks. What had desperately fled this way in fear or rage? It was then that Jake spotted the ventilation grate, partially dislodged from the wall, to reveal a cramped passageway. His curiosity overcame caution. Whatever secrets lay buried within Blackmont Prison, the answer likely hid down darker paths. With effort, Jake prized the grate fully loose and peered into the gaping maw that beckoned beyond, filled with unseen terrors and revelations in equal supply. Taking a deep breath, he clicked off his flashlight and lowered himself into the abyss. As Jake's eyes adjusted to the inkiness surrounding, vague shapes congealed in the tunnel ahead, illuminated by a hazy crimson glow emanating from an unseen point further down. He crept forward cautiously, senses straining for any hint of unseen movement nearby. The close air smelled strongly of damp stone and something darker, almost organic. Rounding a bend, Jake froze as a hidden chamber abruptly came into partial view ahead, partially obscured by a ragged curtain that fluttered in some unfelt draft. Chalked symbols and arcane tracings covered every surface, depicting monstrous entities from hellish realms beyond mortal comprehension. At the chamber's center, a dozen robed figures milled about, making final preparations for their unholy ritual under a thrumming red spotlight. Jake shrank into an alcove, hardly daring to breathe as several robed figures swept past mere feet away, too engrossed in their blasphemous preparations to notice the interloper lurking in the shadows. When they had passed, Jake peered cautiously into the chamber once more. An enormous inverted pentagram had been scrawled upon the floor, polished black rods thrust skyward at each point. Within the unclean diagram's boundaries, unidentifiable relics and implements were carefully laid out upon an enormous stone altar stained brown with ages of sacrifice. A sinking sense of horror gripped Jake as he noticed bindings of chain welded to the chamber's far wall, where decrepit cells lined the rough-hewn granite. It was within one such cell that Jake found himself imprisoned, the fetid straw doing little to stifle the damp stone below. As his eyes adjusted further to the gloom, Jake choked back a gasp. Another figure lay chained opposite, its gaunt form almost skeletal beneath tattered rags. Was it even still alive? Renewing his struggle against the unyielding manacles, Jake surveyed his prison for any means of escape. The ancient iron had long rusted into the stone, impossible to break or pick loose. His fingers explored every nook and crevice frantically, scraping skin raw in desperation. It was then, peering through a gap in the warped wooden slats, that he witnessed a robed figure anointing blasphemous sigils upon the cultists themselves in preparation for what horrors lay to come under the full moon's light. As midnight drew inexorably closer, the cloaked figures withdrew to their places upon the points of the unholy star, nothing visible within the cowls save endless shadow. Only their leader, distinguished by his ornate crimson and ebony robes, continued preparations at the altar. From within billowing sleeves, he produced arcane tomes bound in sealskin and intestine, murmuring ominous invocations which curdled Theki beyond. The feverish whispering of the assembled acolytes swelled to a dreadful crescendo, drowning out all other sound. Between phrases, only a single word emerged with nightmarish clarity. Nyarlathotep, Nyarltolep, Nyarlathotep. Whatever entity they called upon, its name chilled Jake to his soul. Desperate, he searched his prison for any tool to break his bonds before the final words were spoken and the forces of the outer dark responded. But as midnight struck, all hope seemed lost. As the first stroke of midnight faded into silence, an unearthly wind swept through the cavernous chamber. The cultists' uncanny chanting peaked in a horrifying crescendo of blasphemous incantation, the words twisting and unspooling in ways that raked mercilessly against sanity and comprehension. From beyond the membrane of reality came an answer, not in words, but in a monstrous wave of implacable malevolence that engulfed the chamber. Jake collapsed against the wall of his cell, senses reeling under an onslaught of alien terror. Through blurring vision, he glimpsed a rent appearing before the altar, within which writhed a form so profoundly wrong that consciousness strained to perceive it. Antlered and chitinous pseudopods extended from an impossible geometry that suggested angles beyond 3 dimensions, emanating a fell aura which drained vitality and reason with its very proximity. From its slack maw issued an ecstatic hissing as the cult dedicated their lives in wicked tribute. Crimson tendrils snaked forth to eagerly receive their willing sacrifice, blotting out shrieks of agony which echoed the innumerable cries of past blasphemies performed here. With chilling deliberation, it scanned the gathered acolytes with several of its myriad eyes, directing telepathic currents of affection and promise which drove minds swiftly to new depths of depravity. Jake doubled over, vomiting uncontrollably as the sheer virulence of its unearthly emanations assailed his human frailty. Through tear-filled eyes, he glimpsed the husk-like figure chained opposite rear up with preternatural strength, belying its withered form. Its jaws gaped impossibly wide to release an anguished howl that resonated with alien overtones, communicating a message of warning to the interloper beyond mortal ken. Galvanized by some primal instinct of self-preservation, Jake resumed his desperate battle to free himself from imprisonment. Spying a jagged sliver of rock within reach, he set to work sawing mercilessly at the rusty bonds around his bleeding wrist. At long last, with a shriek of tortured metal, the manacle split open. Wasting no time, Jake lunged for the pile of abandoned equipment and detritus, amid which something, anything, could serve as a weapon against the unholy forces that now held sway. His fingers closed around the heft of an iron bar, doubtlessly once used to subdue unruly inmates. Gripping it white-knuckled, Jake stole towards the ritual chamber on silent feet. Peering through the slats, he witnessed unspeakable unions as cultists prostrated eagerly before the Nameless One, offering wretched pacts and dark sorceries in return for glimpses of forbidden power. With a primal roar born of desperation, Jake crashed through the barrier and lunged at the creature's hellish form. His crude bludgeon bit deep, eliciting an inhuman shriek that near shattered sanity. Cultists reeled in corrupted ecstasy at the prospect of spilling profane blood. Jake tore into them with barbarous frenzy, blocking out their gurgling deaths and focusing only on escaping the lightless tunnels before him. A hideous, bubbling laugh echoes after him as the warping portal began to shrink, the abomination's bulk diminishing yet still gargantuan. Jake fled blindly, hauling the delirious inmate with him. Sounds of slithering pursuit spurred him faster into the swallowing dark, praying feverishly for escape and daylight as warped voices promised unending pursuit through twisted blasphemies yet to come. Somehow, impossibly, the entrance came into view, freedom and oblivion beyond. With a final lunge, they tumbled forth, gate slamming behind them a moment before unnatural appendages shot through. Pale moonlight bathed their heaving forms, and for a time they could only lay shuddering as sanity and strength slowly mended. When Jake at last found voice, he croaked only 2 words to the wizened prisoner beside him before merciful darkness took them both. It's over. Jake had finally made it out of the old abandoned prison, bringing the prisoner with him. A line of death and destruction was left in his wake, but he had made it out, barely clinging to his life and what minuscule amount of sanity he had left. He looked at the prisoner and said, "We need to make sure no one ever comes to this horrible place again."